Among all the indie releases we saw lately, there was one game that really stood out to me. People call it Furi, and for the record that pronunciation is actually wrong, because Fu and Ri are Japanese syllables and they form the katakana Furi, meaning free. See also this for evidence. Yes, I know, that's gonna be incredibly fun to pronounce for the rest of the review. So, Furi is a boss rush game, which means it consists of only boss fights connected by short walking sections. Longtime viewers will remember that I really enjoyed a game called Ys Origin, and Furi has a lot of elements in common with it. Simple controls, long elaborate boss fights, fast gameplay, isometric perspective, and an amazing soundtrack. And generally speaking, both games are the absolute shit. First off, let's take a look at Furi's story. The setup is very simple. You play a samurai lookalike called Ryder, who is held captive in a prison consisting of a bunch of floating islands connected via portals. Suddenly, halfway through a healthy torture session, a guy in a pink bunny mask appears out of nowhere, frees Ryder and wants to escape with him. The catch being that Ryder has to clear out all the jailers, as only their deaths will open up the portals to the next island, and this leads to the player fighting a linear succession of bosses one-on-one. The story itself is almost entirely told through the walking sections between bosses, and from what I saw in discussions and reviews, most people call these the worst part of the game, since you basically just hit the appropriately named auto walk button and watch your character move to the next portal while the guy with the pink bunny mask chews your ear off. So I can understand that criticism, but personally I really don't mind them. They have great music and unconventional camera angles for one, but most importantly the dialogue, while fairly cryptic, is surprisingly decent. Your companion usually informs you about the next opponent while slowly revealing the motives behind freeing you, which makes perfect sense in the context of the game, and while the jailers talk about the main character, Ryder, the writing intentionally leaves the player in the dark about who he actually is so that it can be revealed at the end. Which means that Furi doesn't have a lot of clunky exposition, and knowing the twist shines a new light on all the dialogue should you do a second playthrough, and that is how the game is built anyway. The character designs and visuals are fantastic as well. The person responsible here is Takashi Okazaki, the creator of Afro Samurai, whose art style just oozes with over-the-top stylization and color, and everything is perfectly matched by what is probably the best video game soundtrack of the year. Honestly, Western developers have just been killing it lately with great soundtracks, and Furi gets right on that list by featuring a collection of melodic and tense synthwave tracks from various DJs, some of which were also featured in Hotline Miami, so fans of those games will feel right at home. You might have guessed it already, but this soundtrack isn't only great on its own, it also adds a lot of excitement to the gameplay. As I mentioned earlier, Furi's control scheme is intentionally simple, making the game very intuitive to play. You have a ranged attack, a melee combo, a dash and a parry, and all of these moves, except the parry, can also be charged by holding down the respective button to make the dash go farther and the ranged and melee attacks deal higher unavoidable damage. Also, at certain boss stages, the camera zooms in and forces you into melee only combat, and this replaces your pistol with a second way to power up your melee attack. Overall, I think this control scheme is very well designed. The small amount of moves makes it very accessible, but being able to power them up gives the player a lot of room to optimize his damage. Meanwhile, the different attacks bosses use can also be summarized with only a few categories. There are melee sections, projectile attacks, shockwave attacks and bullet hell sections. So while this game's combat isn't overly complicated, the variety of attacks Furi throws at you with only a handful of mechanics is pretty damn impressive, and constantly forced me to learn and adapt. Of course, improving your skill and practicing would be pointless if the game wasn't also mercilessly difficult, but thankfully it is. The incoming attacks are relentless, and the boss fights have up to 7 different stages, so Furi becomes a test of endurance as much as memory and execution. Probably the most important feature here to balance out the difficulty is the winner-takes-all health bar system. You always start out with full HP and 3 lives, manage to beat a boss phase and you get back all your health as well as 1 life should you not be on the maximum amount already. Lose your entire health bar however and the fight resets to the beginning of the current phase with the boss getting fully healed instead. Lose all lives and you have to restart the entire fight. This basically turns every life into a checkpoint, and as long as you beat the opponent's current health bar before he beats yours, you move on to the next stage with an extra try. So even if you lost lives in earlier stages, it is still very feasible for the player to come back into later phases with a maximum amount of hit points and lives, making Furi feel like an incredibly fair challenge. Balancing out toughness and fairness is exactly what a game like this needs to prevent frustration from taking over, and Furi just fucking nails it in this respect, to the point where I just couldn't stop playing. I couldn't stop throwing myself against this wall. Multiple times I tried putting down the game for at least a few hours because I was so pissed, but still came back 50 minutes later trying again and again until I finally beat it. Yet afterwards I was still pumped, so I immediately started a second playthrough on the highest difficulty, which for the record is borderline fucking absurd, but eventually overcame the challenge too and beat the game again. I was already sold on Furi after the first playthrough, but the second one sealed it. It's been a while since I felt this much satisfaction from overcoming a challenge, and very rarely does something remind me so explicitly that this exact feeling is why I fucking love video games. Furi is a shining example of what a classic game should be, and for that it has a special place reserved in my heart. But as I keep saying, almost no game is actually perfect, and despite Furi definitely being my game of the year so far, it would be negligent of me not to mention where I think it could still be improved. My main complaint with this game would be its theatrics and how often they are repeated. Theatrics for me means all the visual and audio flavor added to the gameplay to stylize it. There are, for example, 1,000 moments in which Furi takes control from the player for just a second to show a stylish animation, like the boss transitioning between phases or the little cutscene that plays whenever you land a charged melee attack. As with all cutscenes, the more you see these, the more tedious they become, and to me at least they contradict the repetitive nature of this game that has you going through the same exact fights over and over. Especially when you are in learning mode and trying to reach a specific stage of the fight in order to figure out what to do there, every little unskippable cutscene just wastes seconds of your time, which quickly adds up. Same with the quick time events, which in Furi's defense are rare and you see them coming from a mile away, but they also take a few seconds to complete every time while barely dealing damage to the opponent. The problem here is that once again Furi demands a I need to optimize everything mindset, so naturally you'd want to avoid every idle moment, yet the game makes you wait again and again. My recommendation personally would be to reduce all of these to a minimum. For example, instead of a charged melee attack playing a cutscene where you hit the opponent multiple times, it could just open him up for a single attack that deals all that damage at once and immediately goes back to gameplay. And afterwards you could still make that attack as theatrically satisfying as possible. Phase transitions too could go by faster and let the player remain in control so that he can at least position himself for the next phase, and personally I would get rid of what little cuties there are in this game, as well as use voice lines a bit less frequently to make them less repetitive. For another criticism, I feel like Furi could reward you more for perfecting earlier phases. It's not uncommon in this game to blast through all the stages of a boss only to reach the final bullet hell and lose all your lives in a minute while trying to figure out what to do. That of course means you have to repeat the entire fight in order to get to the final phase again, which even if you know it by heart at that point takes quite a while. As I mentioned earlier, you do get a life and full health back when you complete a phase, but if you breeze through the earlier stages anyway, that doesn't really help you anymore, so I feel like it would be a good incentive to reward the player with a fourth life when he manages to beat a phase, say without taking damage or within a certain time limit. Because once again, this game is about optimizing and learning, and when you have consistently shown your mastery of earlier phases, an extra try at a later one would make quite a difference. Those really are my biggest gripes though. There are some smaller issues like melee sections on the hardest difficulty where dodging the shockwaves requires a level of precision that the controls and camera angle don't really support, and some frame drops on one boss in particular, but ultimately Furi just kinda blew me away. And don't take that at face value. At this point I'm almost convinced that I have a genetic predisposition to enjoy these twitchy action games that make you repeat the same fight over and over until you get it right. For some people this game will be incredibly frustrating, but what I appreciate about 3 is that it never pretends to be anything else than what it is. Even reading interviews and articles from the developers shows you that they set out specifically to create this kind of game, and damn did they ever succeed. So sure, it might be a bit pricey, especially if you don't intend to play through it a second time, but if anything I just said sounded enticing to you, you owe it to yourself to give Furi a try, because there are so very few games like it out there right now. Bouken signing out.